I didn't stop her from laughing because I needed witnesses. The sound rolled across the ballroom like it belonged there, bright and effortless, bouncing off crystal glasses and polished marble, and for a second it almost felt normal, like just another corporate dinner where people said things they didn't mean and laughed a little too loud to prove they belong. But I knew better. I stood there with a glass of bourbon in my hand, the ice barely melting, watching my wife tilt her head back just enough to let the chandelier light catch her smile, the same smile I used to think meant something, now echoing in a room full of people who thought they understood the story they were watching unfold. Daniel leaned in first. Of course he did. Men like him always go first when they think the ground is safe, his voice just loud enough to carry, just soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to, asking me how it felt, that question wrapped in a joke, wrapped in another laugh, and then another. And Olivia didn't interrupt, didn't redirect, didn't even glance at me the way a partner might when a line gets crossed. She laughed with him, easy, natural, practiced, like this version of me was the only one she'd ever known. I let it happen. I let every word land exactly where it was meant to, because stopping them would have been a mistake, correcting them would have ruined the timing, and I needed timing more than pride. People think silence means you don't have anything to say. They think it means you're small, or unsure, or outmatched, but silence is just space, and space is where people reveal themselves if you give them enough of it. So I gave them space. I leaned back slightly, relaxed my shoulders, let the room believe what it wanted, because belief makes people careless, and careless people talk. Daniel raised his glass again, pushing a little further now that the first laugh had landed, asking what I did all day while Olivia handled the real work. The kind of line that earns approval in rooms like this, the kind of line that gets repeated later when people want to feel like insiders. And again, she didn't stop him, she added to it, just a small comment, barely noticeable. Unless you were listening for it, something about how I preferred staying out of the spotlight, how I was more comfortable that way. The table laughed again, softer this time, but deeper, because now it felt true to them. I watched their faces, one by one, the subtle shifts, the nods, the quick glances that said they were filing this version of me away as fact, and I memorized it, every expression, every word. Because later details matter, later details make things undeniable. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the burn settle, not because I needed it, but because it gave me a reason to wait, and waiting was the point. Inside, everything was quiet, not empty, just controlled, like standing in a room before a storm hits and knowing exactly when the first drop will fall. Olivia finally looked at me then, not with concern, not with hesitation, but with that same polished calm she wore at every event. Like this was all part of the script, like I would smile, maybe deflect, maybe laugh along, play the roles she had already assigned me, and for years I had, that was the truth, for years I let rooms like this define me because it was easier than correcting them, easier than explaining things people weren't ready to understand. But tonight wasn't about ease, tonight was about clarity, and clarity requires patience. So I met her eyes and gave her nothing, no reaction, no defense. Just a steady look that passed through her and settled somewhere beyond the table, and that unsettled her for half a second, just enough that I saw it, just enough that I knew she felt the shift even if she didn't understand it yet. Daniel filled the silence quickly, eager to keep control of the moment, eager to push one more step, and that was exactly what I needed, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became, the more they committed to the version of events they believed was safe, and I needed them to commit. I needed them to say everything out loud, not hinted, not implied, but stated. Clean and complete, because once something is said in a room like this, with this many people, under this kind of light, it doesn't disappear, it lingers, it anchors itself, and anchors are hard to move later. I checked my watch briefly, not because I was impatient, but because timing matters. Every plan has a moment where it locks into place, where everything that's been set in motion finally aligns, and I could feel that moment getting closer, not rushed, not forced, just inevitable, like gravity. And as the laughter built again, as the room leaned further into the story they thought they were telling, I let it all settle. Every word, every glance, every careless assumption, because when the moment came, I didn't want confusion, I wanted certainty, and certainty only comes when people believe they've already won. Daniel did not notice the shift because men like him rarely do. He was too focused on the sound of his own voice, too comfortable in the rhythm of approval as a few more people leaned in closer, their attention tightening around the circle like a quiet spotlight. And that is when conversations start to change, not louder, but sharper, more specific, more dangerous. He lowered his tone just enough to make it feel personal. Like he was letting the group in on something real, something honest, and honesty in the wrong hands is just another form of carelessness. He asked Olivia how she managed it, how she carried everything while I, in his words, drifted through life without pressure, without ambition, without contribution. And there it was again, that wordless agreement in the room, the subtle nods, the half smiles, the kind of silent consensus that forms when people decide who matters and who does not. Olivia crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just comfortable, and answered in a way that sounded rehearsed even if she believed it was not. She said I preferred things simple, that I never liked the corporate world, that I was happier staying out of the way, and each sentence built on the last, stacking a version of me that was easy to understand and even easier to dismiss. I watched her carefully, not the words, but the pauses between them, because pauses tell the truth people try to hide. And in those small gaps I could hear something else, not guilt, not hesitation. Just certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from repeating a story long enough that it becomes real, even to the person telling it. I let my fingers rest against the glass, feeling the condensation gather, grounding myself in something physical while everything else played out exactly as expected. A woman across the table, I think her name was Melissa, leaned forward with a polite curiosity that masked judgment, asking if I had ever considered doing something more, something bigger. Something that matched Olivia, and that question was not meant for me, it was meant for the room, meant to reinforce the narrative they were building. I gave a small smile, nothing defensive, nothing confrontational, just enough to keep the tone light, because tone matters, tone keeps people talking, and talking was still the goal. Daniel laughed again, louder this time, encouraged by the lack of resistance, and added that some men get lucky, that some men marry success and call it a strategy. And this time the laughter hit differently, it lingered longer, because now it was no longer just a joke, it was a conclusion, and conclusions are what I needed, conclusions are what hold weight later. I noticed Richard standing just outside the circle, not fully engaged, but listening, his expression neutral in that practiced executive way, the kind of face that reveals nothing but absorbs everything, and that mattered more than anything Daniel could say. Because Richard understood consequences even when he pretended not to, I shifted my stance slightly, just enough to catch his eye for a brief second, not a signal, not a warning, just a reminder that I was aware of him, and that awareness passed between us quietly before he looked away, choosing observation over involvement, which was exactly what I expected. People like him never step in until it is already too late. Olivia touched Daniel's arm lightly. A gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other room, but here, in this moment, it landed with precision, reinforcing everything without saying a word, and Daniel took it as encouragement, pushing further, asking me directly now if I ever felt out of place at events like this, if I ever felt like I did not belong. And there it was, the clean question, the kind that draws a line, the kind that demands a reaction. And for a fraction of a second the room held its breath, waiting to see if I would finally respond the way they expected. But expectations are only useful when you plan to break them, so I let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough to make it uncomfortable, long enough to make them lean in, and then I answered simply, calmly, without edge or defense. I said that I was exactly where I needed to be, and the words settled in a way they did not understand, because they heard them as resignation, as acceptance, as proof that their version of me was correct. But what they missed, what they always miss, is that certainty sounds the same whether it comes from confidence or surrender, and only one of those survives what comes next. I glanced at my watch again, not obvious, just a habit, and this time the second hand mattered. Because timing is not just about patience, it is about precision, and precision requires knowing when enough has been said, when the line has been crossed completely, when every piece is in place. And as Daniel opened his mouth to add one more comment, one more careless assumption, I felt that moment arrive, quiet, exact, undeniable, the point where silence had done its job and words were no longer needed to build the truth, only to reveal it. There is a moment in every conversation when people stop performing and start revealing, and I heard it in the way Daniel hesitated just before speaking again, like he was choosing his next words carefully, not because he respected me, but because he wanted the room to respect him. And that is when people say the most useful things. He smiled, glanced around to make sure he still had their attention, and then said that some men just are not built for pressure, that not everyone is meant to lead. And he gestured loosely in my direction as if I were an example, not a person, and a few people nodded, not aggressively, just enough to show agreement, enough to anchor his point in something that felt real. And Olivia did not interrupt, she did not correct him, she simply took a sip of her drink and let the moment breathe, and that silence from her carried more weight than anything she could have said, because silence can confirm just as much as words. I let that sit, let it settle into the room, into their memory, into whatever version of this night they would replay later, because details matter when stories get told again. I shifted my gaze slowly across the table, not rushed, not confrontational, just observant. Taking in each face as if I were memorizing a photograph I would need later. Melissa looked slightly uncomfortable now, not because of me, but because the conversation had crossed from playful to pointed, and people like her sense that shift even if they do not understand it. Richard remained still, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. I could see it in the way his posture adjusted, in the way his glass stopped moving halfway to his lips, and that told me everything I needed to know. He was listening now. Really listening, and that was important, because there are moments that only matter if the right person hears them. Daniel kept going, unaware that he had already said more than enough. He asked Olivia if she ever wished she had chosen differently, if she ever felt like she had outgrown the life she built with me. And this time the room did not laugh immediately. This time there was a pause, a thin, fragile silence that stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, and in that silence, Olivia made her choice. She smiled, small at first, then wider, and said that people change, that sometimes you realize you need more than what you settled for, and the way she said it was calm, almost thoughtful, like she was offering insight instead of judgment. But the meaning was clear, clear enough that no one needed to ask what she meant, clear enough that it would echo long after the night ended. I felt the weight of that sentence settle, not on me, but into the space around us, into the shared understanding that had just formed, and I knew then that I had everything I needed, because truth spoken freely carries more power than anything forced. I placed my glass down on the table gently, the sound soft but distinct, enough to draw attention without demanding it, and for the first time that night, I stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, just a small shift that changed my position from observer to participant, and that alone was enough to quiet the room. Conversations nearby softened, attention narrowed, and even Daniel straightened slightly, sensing something he could not yet define. I looked at Olivia first, not with anger, not with disappointment, just with clarity. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to question, and then I let my gaze move across the others, one by one, giving each of them a moment to recognize that this was no longer the version of me they had been discussing. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, controlled, the same tone I had used all night. But now it carried something different, something they had not heard before. I said that it was interesting hearing everyone's perspective, that it was helpful, actually, to understand how things looked from the outside, and a few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were being thanked or corrected, and that uncertainty was exactly where I wanted them, because uncertainty makes people listen more carefully. I paused just long enough to let the words settle, to let them replay what had been said, to let them connect the pieces without guidance, and then I added, just as evenly, that clarity matters, especially when decisions are made based on perception. And that sentence landed differently, quieter, heavier, because now there was a direction to it. Now there was a sense that something had been building all along, and that this was not a reaction, but a conclusion. I glanced once more at my watch, not out of habit this time, but confirmation, because timing is not about guessing, it is about knowing, and in that exact second, I felt it, the shift, subtle but absolute, like a door closing somewhere behind them that they did not realize they had walked through. And I understood then that the room had already changed. They just had not caught up to it yet. The room did not erupt or react the way people expect when something shifts. It did not fracture into chaos or confrontation. It simply tightened, like air being pulled out of a space one breath at a time. And that is how you know the moment has changed, not by noise, but by the absence of it. Daniel let out a short laugh, uncertain now, like he was testing whether the tone he had set still applied, but it did not land the same way. It echoed thinner, weaker, and he felt it even if he did not understand why. Olivia's smile remained, but it lost its ease, just slightly. Just enough that the edges did not sit the same on her face, and most people would miss that. But I did not, because I had spent years learning the difference between what people show and what they mean. I kept my posture relaxed, hands at my sides, voice steady, and continued as if nothing had changed, because the most effective way to control a moment is to refuse to acknowledge that it needs controlling. I said that perspective is a powerful thing, that people often build entire conclusions based on what they see in passing. And a few heads nodded automatically, not because they agreed, but because the statement felt safe, neutral, unthreatening. And that is how you guide a room. You give them something they think they already believe, and then you let them follow it further than they intended. I let a small pause settle, just enough to keep them listening, and then I added that sometimes those perspectives miss important details, not intentionally, just because they are not meant to see everything. And now the tone shifted again. Quieter, more focused, because there was direction in what I was saying, a path forming that they could not yet see the end of. Richard's attention locked fully now, his body angled slightly toward me, no longer observing from the edge, but engaged, calculating, and that was the signal I had been waiting for, not from Daniel, not from Olivia, but from him, because when the right person starts paying attention, the rest of the room follows whether they realize it or not. I turned my head slightly, acknowledging him without calling him out, and continued, explaining that I had spent a long time staying out of the spotlight by choice, not circumstance, that stepping back does not always mean stepping down, and that sentence landed differently, heavier, because now it introduced doubt into the narrative they had built, and doubt is the first crack in certainty. Daniel shifted his weight, his confidence adjusting, trying to find footing again, but the ground had already moved. Olivia's eyes flicked to mine for a brief moment, searching for something, not answers, but context, and for the first time that night, she did not seem entirely sure what she was standing on. I let that moment pass without pressing it, because pressure too early breaks the flow, and this was not about force, it was about alignment. I reached into my jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a natural one, like someone retrieving a phone or a card, and that small movement drew attention without demand, the kind of attention that comes from curiosity rather than fear. I held the object loosely in my hand for a second, letting it remain undefined, letting them wonder without giving them anything concrete yet. Because anticipation sharpens focus, and focused people remember more clearly. I said that conversations like this are valuable, that hearing unfiltered opinions can clarify things that might otherwise remain hidden, and now there was no laughter, no casual agreement, just quiet, attentive stillness, the kind that forms when people realize they may have misjudged something but are not yet sure what. I glanced briefly at Olivia again, not accusing, not emotional, just present, and then I continued, explaining that clarity often leads to decisions, and decisions have consequences, not dramatic ones, not immediate ones, but real ones that unfold over time, and that sentence settled deeper than the others, because it carried weight without explanation, the kind of weight people feel before they understand. Daniel opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, to redirect, to reclaim the tone he had lost. But nothing came out, because the space no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, quietly, completely, into something else, something he had not prepared for, and as I looked around the table one last time, taking in the faces that had so confidently defined me just minutes earlier, I knew that everything that needed to be said had already been said, not by me, but by them, exactly as I had needed it to be. I let the silence stretch just a second longer than necessary, not to create tension, but to let it settle into something permanent. because once a room becomes aware of itself, it cannot return to what it was before, and I could feel that awareness now, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in temperature that no one announces but everyone senses. I turned the object in my hand slightly, finally revealing it as my phone. Nothing dramatic, nothing unexpected, just an ordinary device that most people would not think twice about, and that was exactly why it mattered, because the most important things rarely look important at first glance. Daniel's eyes flicked to it, then back to me, searching for context, for control, for something familiar he could anchor himself to, but there was none left for him to grab onto. I spoke calmly, almost conversationally, explaining that I have always believed in clarity, in making sure that when decisions are made, they are based on complete information, not assumptions or impressions formed in passing. And as I spoke, I tapped the screen once, not loudly, not for effect, just enough to wake it, the faint glow reflecting briefly in the glassware around us. And in that small reflection, I saw the first real shift in their expressions, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when people begin to understand that they may have overlooked something essential. I said that tonight had been helpful, that hearing everything laid out so openly removed any uncertainty I might have had, and that sentence landed with precision, because now there was context forming, a connection between what had been said and what might follow. Olivia's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening just slightly, her attention sharpening, because she knew me well enough to recognize that I was not reacting, I was concluding. And conclusions are far more difficult to undo than reactions. Daniel shifted again, attempting to recover, to reframe the moment with a half-smile, asking if this was some kind of joke. His tone lighter than he felt, because humor is the last defense people reach for when control slips. I met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not dismissive, just steady, and said that it was not a joke, that it was simply timing, and that word hung there, quiet and heavy, because timing suggests preparation, and preparation suggests intent, and intent changes everything. I turned slightly toward Richard then, not directly addressing him, but including him, because he was the one who would understand the implications first, and I explained that there are moments when it becomes necessary to step back in, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically, and that stepping back had never meant walking away, it had meant observing, understanding, waiting for the right point to act, and now the room was completely still, no one speaking, no one interrupting. Because the shape of the conversation had shifted beyond anything they had anticipated, I glanced once more at Olivia, and this time there was no smile to meet, only a quiet calculation forming behind her eyes, the kind that comes when someone realizes they may not have been seeing the full picture. I lifted the phone slightly, not presenting it, not displaying anything yet, just holding it in a way that made its presence undeniable, and I said that what mattered most in situations like this is accuracy, that when people speak freely, without filters, they tend to reveal more than they intend, and that information, when captured correctly, becomes very difficult to dispute later. And that was when it landed, not all at once, but in pieces, expressions tightening, eyes narrowing, small shifts of posture that signaled understanding arriving in fragments. Daniel's confidence faded first, replaced by a cautious uncertainty. Olivia's composure held longer, but even she could not fully mask the realization beginning to form. And Richard, to his credit, did not react outwardly at all. But I saw the calculation. In his stillness, the rapid assessment of implications, of risk, of what this meant beyond the room we were standing in. I let them sit with it, did not rush to explain, did not fill the space with unnecessary words, because silence now served a different purpose, not to draw them out, but to let the truth settle in on its own. And after a moment, I said quietly that I had needed them to say everything first, because clarity is most powerful when it comes directly from the source, and once it does, it no longer belongs to interpretation, it becomes fact, and facts, unlike opinions, do not shift when the room changes. No one reached for their drink anymore, no one checked their phone, the room had narrowed into something smaller, tighter, like the world outside the table no longer existed, and that is what truth does when it arrives without warning. It does not explode. It compresses everything around it until there is no space left to escape. Daniel was the first to try, of course he was, People like him always move first when silence becomes unbearable. He let out a short breath, forced a smile that did not quite settle, and said that this had gone too far, that we were all just joking, that nothing said here should be taken seriously, and the way he said it revealed more than anything he had said earlier, because now he was not leading, he was retreating, reframing the past 30 minutes into something harmless, something forgettable, something that could not be used against him. I did not interrupt, I did not correct him. I simply listened, because even now, even in retreat, people continue to give you what you need if you let them speak. Olivia did not laugh this time, she did not support him, she remained still, her eyes fixed on me with a focus that had not been there before, and in that focus I could see the calculation, the reconstruction of every moment that had led here, every word she had allowed, every silence she had chosen. She was not thinking about what had been said anymore. She was thinking about what it meant, and that is when understanding becomes uncomfortable. I nodded slightly, acknowledging Daniel's attempt without accepting it, and said that I understood, that sometimes conversations take a direction no one intends, that people say things casually that sound different when heard later, and I kept my tone even, almost accommodating, because resistance would only make them defensive, and defensive people shut down, and I did not need them to shut down, not yet. I needed them to stay present. I tapped the phone lightly again, not activating anything, just reminding them of its presence, of what it represented, and I explained that context matters, that tone, timing, and exact wording all play a role in how something is understood. Especially when it is revisited, and that word, revisited, landed with a weight that shifted the room again, because it introduced the idea that this moment was not contained, that it did not end here, that it could exist beyond the walls of this ballroom, and that is when people begin to measure their own words against consequences. Richard stepped forward then, just slightly, enough to enter the circle fully, his presence quiet but authoritative, the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. And he asked, calmly, what exactly I was suggesting, not defensive, not confrontational, just precise, and I appreciated that, because precision deserves the same in return. I met his gaze and said that I was not suggesting anything, I was simply clarifying that information, once documented, tends to carry its own implications, and I let that sit, did not elaborate, did not soften it, because the truth does not need decoration when it is already understood. Olivia finally spoke then, her voice controlled, measured, asking what I intended to do with that information, and that question was the first honest one of the night, not because of the words, but because of the intent behind them. She was no longer playing to the room, she was addressing me directly, and that shift mattered more than anything else. I held her gaze for a moment, not as a challenge, but as recognition, and said that intention is often misunderstood. That people assume action must be immediate or visible to be real, but in reality, the most effective decisions are made quietly, long before anyone realizes they have been made, and as I spoke, I could see the realization settling in, not fully formed, but present, like a shadow taking shape behind something they could not yet see clearly. Daniel looked between us, trying to follow, trying to regain footing, but he was no longer part of the center. The conversation had moved beyond him, beyond the initial laughter, into something more controlled, more deliberate. I slipped the phone back into my pocket slowly, deliberately, not as a conclusion, but as a signal. Because sometimes removing something from view makes it more present than displaying it ever could, and I said that what mattered now was not what had been said, but what would happen next, because moments like this do not define people by what they say, they define them by what they choose to do after they understand the consequences, and I let that settle, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a simple truth, the kind that does not need to be repeated to be remembered, and in that quiet, measured stillness, I knew the balance had shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, in a way that no one in that room could undo. Richard did not speak immediately, and that told me more than any response could have, because men in his position do not rush into uncertainty, they measure it, they weigh it, they calculate how much of it is real and how much of it can be controlled. And right now he was realizing that control had already shifted, not away from him entirely, but enough that he could no longer assume the outcome. Olivia remained still. Her posture composed but no longer effortless. The ease she carried earlier had been replaced by something sharper, more deliberate, like she was choosing each breath instead of letting it happen naturally. And that is what pressure does when it is applied correctly. It does not break people, it forces them to think in ways they did not expect. Daniel, on the other hand, was still trying to recover the version of the night he believed he understood. He cleared his throat, attempted another light remark about how things had gotten too serious for what was supposed to be a celebration, but no one followed him this time. No one laughed, not because they disagreed, but because the room had already moved past that tone, and once a room moves forward, it does not go back. I let that failed attempt pass without acknowledgement, because correcting him would only give him relevance again, and he no longer had any. Instead, I shifted my attention back to Richard, because he was the one who mattered now, the one who could see the larger structure forming beyond the conversation. I said quietly that I understood how situations like this can appear from the outside. That perspective often shapes decisions long before facts are fully understood, and he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because he knew exactly what I meant. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice steadied but lower now, asking if there was something I wanted to say clearly, something direct, and that question changed the dynamic again, because it removed the room from the center and placed the focus where it had always belonged, between her and me. I met her gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more final, clarity, and I said that I had already said what needed to be said, that everything else had come from them, and that was the point, because truth carries more weight when it is volunteered, not forced. Daniel shifted again, restless now, looking between us, trying to understand where he stood, but there was no position left for him to hold. He had already defined himself through what he said, and now he had nothing left to add. Richard took a small step closer, not aggressively, but intentionally, and asked if this was going to affect anything beyond tonight. And there it was, the real question, not about the conversation, not about the tension, but about the consequences. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence hold just long enough to make the answer matter, and then I said that everything depends on what people do once they understand the full picture, that moments like this do not create consequences, they reveal them. And that sentence settled deeper than anything before it, because it removed emotion entirely and replaced it with inevitability. Olivia's expression changed then, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to call it out, but I saw it, the precise moment when realization fully formed, when she understood that this was not about reacting to what had happened tonight. It was about everything that had been building long before it, everything she had chosen to ignore or redefine, and now those choices had context she could not control. I reached for my glass again, not because I needed it, but because the gesture returned the moment to something almost ordinary, almost calm, and that contrast made everything else feel heavier. I took a slow sip, set it back down, and said that the next steps were not something that needed to be decided here, not in front of an audience, not in a room that had already heard more than it expected, and that was the final shift, because it signaled that this moment, as significant as it felt, was only a part of something larger, something already in motion. Daniel looked relieved for a second, as if that meant the pressure would dissolve, that things might return to normal. But relief built on misunderstanding does not last. Olivia did not look relieved at all. She looked focused, calculating, already trying to see paths forward, outcomes she could still influence. But there are moments where influence no longer belongs to the person who once held it, and this was one of them. Richard nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the reality of what had just settled into place, and as the room began to breathe again, as small conversations cautiously restarted around us, I understood that nothing in that space was the same, not the people, not the dynamics, not the assumptions that had filled the air just minutes before, because once clarity arrives, it does not leave quietly, it stays, shaping everything that comes after, whether anyone is ready for it or not. The room did not return to what it was, even as conversations slowly restarted around us, because once a certain line has been crossed, people do not forget it, they just pretend to move past it, and I could see that pretense forming now in small, careful ways, glasses being lifted again, voices lowering into safer topics, laughter attempting to find its rhythm again but never quite landing the same. And that is how you know something has shifted permanently, not by what people say, but by what they avoid saying next. I stepped back slightly from the table, not as a retreat, but as a repositioning, because I no longer needed to be at the center of it. The center had already served its purpose. Olivia watched me closely now, no longer performing for anyone else, her attention fixed, deliberate. The kind of focus that comes when someone realizes the narrative they were controlling has slipped beyond their reach. She took a small step toward me, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us, asking if we could talk privately, and that request, simple as it sounded, carried a different weight than anything she had said earlier, because it acknowledged that this was no longer something to be managed in public. I held her gaze for a moment, not rejecting, not accepting, just measuring, because timing still mattered, even now, especially now. I said that there would be time for that, but not here. Not tonight, and she nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves, because she knew that control over when and where had already shifted. Daniel had faded almost completely into the background by this point, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet detachment, like he was trying to minimize his presence in a situation he could no longer influence, and people around him were doing the same, subtly creating distance without making it obvious. Because association carries weight, and no one wants to be tied too closely to something they do not fully understand. Richard remained where he was, his posture composed, but his mind clearly working through implications, not emotional ones, but structural ones, the kind that affect decisions, reputations, trajectories, and that is where this had always been heading, not toward a confrontation, but toward a recalibration. I turned slightly toward him and said that I appreciated his time tonight, keeping the tone professional, measured, because respect maintains clarity even when everything else shifts, and he responded in kind, his voice steady, acknowledging that we should speak soon, more formally, more directly, and that exchange alone carried more meaning than anything that had been said earlier, because it confirmed what had already been understood without needing to define it. Olivia remained still for a moment longer, then spoke again, quieter now, asking if I had planned all of this, not accusing, not emotional, just seeking a truth she could anchor to, and I considered the question briefly before answering, not because I needed time, but because precision matters. I said that I had planned to listen, that everything else had simply followed from that, and that answer unsettled her more than anything else could have, because it removed the idea of manipulation and replaced it with something harder to argue against, inevitability. I adjusted my jacket slightly, a small, ordinary gesture that contrasted with the weight of everything that had just unfolded, and I said that sometimes the most important decisions are not made in the moment they appear, but long before. When patterns begin to form and clarity starts to take shape, and that sentence settled between us, not as a warning, not as a declaration, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had already been set in motion. I gave the table one final glance, taking in the people who had so confidently defined me just a short time ago, now quieter, more cautious, more aware, and I understood that nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be emphasized, because the moment had already completed itself. It had reached its natural conclusion without force, without escalation, exactly as it was meant to. I turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a steady movement away from the center of the room, and as I did, the noise behind me resumed, softer, more fragmented, as if the space itself was trying to recover from something it could not fully process, and I walked toward the exit with the same calm I had carried all night, because the outcome had never depended on volume or reaction, it had depended on patience. On timing, on allowing people to reveal exactly who they were when they believed no one was truly listening, and now that they had, there was nothing left to question, only what would come next, and that part no longer required an audience. The hallway outside the ballroom felt quieter than it should have, not because there was no sound, but because the noise no longer carried the same weight. Laughter from inside faded into something distant, almost irrelevant, like a memory already losing its clarity, and as the doors closed behind me, I felt the shift complete itself, not in a dramatic way, not with any sense of triumph or loss, just a clean, final alignment of everything that had been building long before tonight. I walked slowly across the marble floor, the steady rhythm of my steps grounding the moment, each one marking distance not just from the room, but from the version of myself that had once stood inside it unnoticed, unchallenged, undefined. And I realized then that nothing that happened in that room had surprised me, not the laughter, not the assumptions, not even Olivia's words, because none of it had appeared suddenly. It had all been there in smaller forms. Quieter moments, conversations that did not quite sit right, silences that carried more meaning than they should have, and tonight had simply brought it all into focus, into something undeniable. My phone remained in my pocket, untouched now, because its purpose had already been fulfilled, not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as confirmation, a way to ensure that what had been revealed could not be rewritten later, and that mattered more than any immediate reaction ever could. I reached the front entrance and paused for a moment, looking out through the glass at the city beyond, lights stretching across the skyline, steady and indifferent, a reminder that most things continue exactly as they are regardless of what shifts inside a single room, and that perspective settled something in me, a clarity that had nothing to do with anyone else, only with what came next. Olivia's voice echoed faintly in my mind, not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. The way she had spoken as if the narrative was already decided, and I understood now that certainty is not always confidence, sometimes it is just repetition, a story told often enough that it becomes easier to believe than to question, and tonight had interrupted that pattern, not loudly, not forcefully, but completely. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cool night air cutting through the warmth of the building, sharp and grounding, and for a second I just stood there, letting it settle, letting everything align without forcing it into a conclusion it did not need, because conclusions do not always arrive with declarations, sometimes they arrive quietly, in the absence of doubt, in the absence of anything left to explain. I walked toward the parking area, the distant hum of traffic filling the space around me, steady, predictable, and I thought about how many moments in life hinge on what is said versus what is heard, how often people mistake silence for weakness when it is actually control, how often they assume the absence of reaction means the absence of awareness, and that misunderstanding had been the foundation of everything that unfolded tonight. I reached my car and paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was the point where the moment fully transitioned from what had happened to what would happen next, and that distinction matters, because what happens next is never decided in the same place where the truth is revealed. It is decided afterward, in clarity, in distance, in the absence of noise. I unlocked the door and sat inside, the quiet of the interior sealing off the outside world for a moment, and I finally took out my phone, not to review anything, not to replay what had been said, but simply to confirm that it was there, that the record existed, untouched, unchanged. And then I set it down again, because I did not need to look at it to know what it contained. I leaned back slightly, hands resting on the steering wheel, and let out a slow breath, not relief, not exhaustion, just release, the kind that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its natural end, and in that stillness, one thought settled clearly above the rest, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, that silence had never been about avoiding the truth. It had been about allowing it to surface completely, without interruption, without distortion, exactly as it needed to be, and now that it had, there was nothing left to wait for, only decisions to be made with a clarity that could not be undone.